Hi, my name is Zoe, and the morning after my wedding, my mother-in-law appeared at my house holding a pen with the cap already off, her voice smooth but firm as she told me to sign everything away, everything my grandfather had left me, insisting I would not need it in this family, and although the words should have shattered me, I did not scream, and I did not cry. I only felt a stillness inside me that kept me steady. I fixed my eyes on the notary standing beside her, and in that moment understood that all of this had been arranged long before the vows were spoken. And while they believed my silence was weakness, they did not realize I had kept quiet for a reason. They did not know that what I had inherited stretched far beyond a company, and they certainly did not imagine how costly my silence was about to become for them. Before I go further, I want to say your support means a world to me. But most of all, your likes are what keep these stories alive. Without them, it's hard to create and move forward. So if you enjoy being here, click the like button. It's easy for you and huge support for me. As I thought of that, my own world was still wrapped in the faint fragrance of lilies and champagne clinging to the sheets around me, as if the celebration had not yet faded from the air. Dean's arm was resting heavily across my stomach, his warm breath brushing the back of my neck as he slept peacefully, unaware of the storm quietly circling us, and I remained motionless, my eyes wide open in the dim light of the master bedroom at his family's sprawling estate just outside Austin, holding inside me truths I had not yet shared. I had never told him, and as I lay there with one hand tucked beneath my pillow, I thought again about the sealed folder buried deep in my suitcase, the folder that held the company my grandfather had built brick by brick in the shadow of the Texas oil fields, a company that was now mine completely, legally, silently, without anyone else's knowledge. He had passed away 2 years earlier, not long after my parents had stopped calling, and I could still see myself at his hospice bedside, my fingers wrapped around his frail hand as he pulled me closer and whispered his last words, warning me never to speak of what was sacred until I knew who was safe. And those words, simple as they were, became the promise I kept. I have always been the kind of person who listens far more than she speaks, and perhaps that is why no one in my family, neither my mother nor my father nor even my older sisters, ever discovered that my grandfather had left everything to me. They had convinced themselves his company had collapsed more than 10 years ago, repeating that story to everyone after he refused to sell it off the way the rest of the family urged him to. But in truth, he never let it go. Now that legacy rested securely in trust under my name, while beyond the window the Texas sky was only just beginning to lighten with the soft blush of dawn. Carefully, I slid Dean's arm off my waist, eased myself out of bed, and padded softly toward the bathroom, each step quiet, every movement deliberate. I only wanted to breathe. This should have been the calm morning after our wedding, the first real day of our life together as husband and wife, a time for coffee shared in the kitchen or perhaps a gentle walk across the grounds of the estate, nothing more. But that was not what unfolded. By the time I had finished showering and dressed, the house was already alive with the muted rhythm of voices and footsteps echoing down the halls. Instead of the warm welcome I had expected, or a cheerful breakfast with my new in-laws, there came a polite knock on the door. A maid stood waiting and informed me in a hushed tone that Mrs. Celeste requested my presence downstairs in the drawing room. For the first time, she addressed me formally as Mrs. Dean Whitlow. The title pressed against me like a weight across my chest. I walked down the long corridor, passing rows of oil portraits that captured Dean's ancestors watching from their gilded frames, past polished tables set with cut crystal that sparkled in the morning light. The air itself carried the sharp scent of lemon polish mixed with the lingering heaviness of old money, and with every step I understood more clearly the world I had just entered. Celeste was already waiting when I entered the room, seated with perfect elegance, her posture flawless, ankles crossed neatly, pearls shining faintly in the morning light, while beside her stood a man in a dark suit who remained utterly silent, his presence deliberate and imposing. On the table before them rested a leather folder, a polished silver notary seal, and a pen already uncapped, as if everything had been prepared in advance. "Good morning, darling," Celeste said, her tone as rich and sweet as warm syrup, before adding with calm certainty that it was time to formalize my role in the household. She insisted it was nothing more than a formality, but the weight of her words settled like a net cast carefully around me. I forced a small smile, blinked twice, and walked toward the table, while the man beside her, wordless and unreadable, slid the folder directly in front of me. It was already open to the place where my signature belonged, and as my eyes landed on the page, something inside me turned cold, not a chill on the surface of my skin, but a shiver running deep down my spine. Slowly, I lowered myself into the chair, lifted the document, and prepared to read. At the top, the title declared itself with heavy authority: Durable Power of Attorney, Domestic and Financial Affairs. My fingers lingered on the edges of the paper as though weighing its gravity, the sentences dense with legal phrasing, yet clear enough to anyone willing to look past the veil of language and into the truth they concealed. "This is interesting," I said softly, letting the pages shift beneath my fingers as though I had never seen that phrase before, and then asked, with deliberate calm, if I might review it with my attorney first. Celeste's smile held its polished surface, but her eyes betrayed her for the briefest flicker, just long enough to reveal the irritation simmering beneath her control. If I hadn't spent my entire life studying silence and learning the meaning in pauses and glances, I might have missed it completely. Instead, I caught it, tucked it away, and watched as she smoothed her expression again, replying with unbroken sweetness that of course I could have it reviewed, assuring me with effortless charm that it was only a family matter and nothing more. But I already understood that beneath her gentleness lived calculation, and beneath her syrupy tone waited the demand of someone who expected to own what was never hers to claim. "No pressure at all," she had said, and I responded with a polite nod before closing the folder, hiding the weight of my decision behind the same composure I had practiced for years. I had grown up as the quiet one, the daughter who was easily overlooked, the child who never raised her voice, never fought for space, never pressed back against the noise of others. But silence never meant blindness, and while I kept still, I was always watching, always listening, storing away every slip and every crack in the masks people wore. In that instant, I understood with clarity how they viewed me, a simple Southern bride who had married into their carefully preserved world of old money, a woman who, in their eyes, carried no fortune of her own, no power, no threat, and certainly no force capable of unsettling their well-polished order. To them I was harmless, pliable, the perfect addition to their legacy, soft enough to mold and too naive to resist. That illusion worked to my advantage, and I leaned into it deliberately, because that afternoon I smiled as I chatted with lingering guests still drifting away from the weekend's celebration, allowed photographs to be taken without resistance, and even sat quietly to write thank you notes in my journal so they could later be copied neatly onto cards. Every move was intentional, every gesture carefully chosen, because I knew the part I was playing, and I played it to perfection. By the time the sun lowered behind the line of tall cypress trees and the cicadas began their evening chorus, Dean and I had returned to the guest wing, where he loosened his tie and looked at me casually, asking if I had spoken with his mother that day. Without hesitation, I answered with ease, masking everything that had passed, and said only that we had shared tea. He smiled softly, pressed a kiss against the side of my head, and began unbuttoning his shirt as though nothing in the world was amiss, as if the day had unfolded without tension or hidden agendas. Yet, while he moved with casual ease, I walked toward my suitcase, unzipped the false lining I had stitched with care, and drew out the sealed manila folder, its weight undeniable, its surface embossed with my grandfather's initials, the very symbol of the legacy he had entrusted to me alone. The folder felt heavier than paper had any right to be, thick with documents that represented not just wealth but protection, foresight, and love wrapped in the form of legal armor, and for a quiet moment I held it close in both hands, grounding myself in its presence. I breathed in slowly, lowered my voice to a whisper meant only for myself and the memory of the man who had believed in me, and said gently, "Thank you, Grandpa." When at last I slid the folder back into its hiding place and closed the suitcase again, my eyes caught on something across the room that sent a shiver through me. On the small table in the corner, left behind almost carelessly, rested the pen Celeste had carried that morning, still uncapped, lying in wait as though it anticipated a different kind of signature, one she had been certain would belong to me. The image seared itself into my mind, for even though her lips had smiled when I refused, her eyes had delivered a promise in silence, a message more powerful than her words, a warning that I would regret my defiance. That look lingered long after she had left the room, following me like smoke clinging to fabric, a shadow I carried with me into the next morning. I woke in Dean's childhood bedroom, which Celeste had sweetly called our temporary honeymoon suite, yet the moment my eyes opened, I felt that something in the air had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The window stood open, letting in the morning bird song, but the sheets beside me were cold, the bed emptied of his presence, and Dean was already gone. I slipped into a robe and made my way downstairs, the house strangely subdued for a place that had been overflowing with celebration only a day earlier. I passed the formal dining room where Dean had promised we would share brunch with family, just the two of us and those who truly mattered. But the room was silent, untouched, absent of the warmth he had described. No scent of bacon or biscuits lingered, no sound of dishes or laughter filled the air, only the low, steady hum of a vacuum somewhere above. In the kitchen, I discovered a note written in Celeste's tight, looping hand that read simply, "Brunch canceled. Some things came up. We'll reschedule." When I opened the refrigerator, the fruit tray I had prepared the night before was missing, and so was the champagne I had chilled. Crossing through the foyer, my eyes landed on another detail. The neat stack of wedding gifts that had been left by the staircase was gone as well. At that moment, Dean returned from the patio with a golf cap in hand, and when I asked what had happened to brunch, he kissed my cheek as if nothing at all was unusual. "Mom thought it would be too much," he said lightly. "She wanted you to rest." And when I pressed about the gifts, he only blinked before explaining that she was reorganizing the sunroom, had probably moved them there. And his casual tone left me smiling on the surface, while something heavy twisted in my chest. Because it wasn't just the absence of breakfast or the disappearance of gifts that unsettled me. It was the way the house itself seemed to press inward, the walls drawing closer as if pushing me toward the edges of a life I was meant to inhabit. Later that afternoon, while folding the last of our laundry, that feeling still lingered, and my thoughts drifted back 2 years to the final quiet moment I had shared alone with my grandfather. We had been together in his garden, him carefully pruning a stubborn rosebush while I sat nearby shelling pecans, when he paused mid-trim, lifted his eyes to the sky, and spoke in that steady way of his, saying that some people love power so much they forget entirely how to love people. I remember glancing at him with confusion, unsure what had stirred that thought in him, unable then to understand what he was trying to prepare me for. He went on more softly, telling me that if I ever came to hold something truly valuable, I must never allow others to mistake that for who I was, because if they did, they would see me as nothing more than a tool to use or worse, an obstacle to remove. I nodded, uncertain at the time, not yet able to see the depth of his warning, but now, 3 days into my marriage, I finally understood exactly what he meant. That evening, while Dean chatted with his cousin on the phone, Celeste called me outside to the driveway where she stood beside a gleaming silver SUV, a ribbon wrapped tightly across its polished hood, her smile wide as she announced the surprise. "It was," she said proudly, "my wedding gift from them." The car shining in the fading light with clean lines and leather seats that reflected the sunset like something out of a showroom. I thanked her with sincerity until she casually slipped a small envelope into my hand, telling me it was the title paperwork, and when I opened it, my heart went cold, because the name printed there was not mine, not even Dean's, but hers. With practiced sweetness, she added that I was welcome to use it as if it were my own, though legally, of course, it would remain in the family, and in that moment her generosity revealed itself for what it truly was, a claim disguised as a gift. Before I could even respond to the so-called gift, Celeste smoothly produced yet another folder, her tone casual as she described it as just a bit of housekeeping. Something about aligning family assets, assuring me with a dismissive wave that although it was a lot of legal blah blah, their attorney insisted it would make everything simpler, cleaner, more efficient. I opened it and flipped through the opening pages, my eyes catching on terms like asset access, power of substitution, and joint holdings, the words leaping from the paper like quiet warnings. I smiled again, calm and collected, and told her I would, of course, need to have my attorney review it. She responded with a breezy, just protocol, though she did not fool me, because while her voice stayed smooth, her jaw tightened in a way that spoke louder than words. That night, back in the bedroom, I sat quietly on the bed while Dean changed out of his golf clothes, chatting idly about his cousin's new house and their plans to invest together in a car wash franchise. I did not mention the car parked outside or the contract hidden in my bag. Instead, I stayed silent, holding my questions and watching as if nothing had happened. What I did instead was listen the way my grandfather had taught me to, not only to words, but to the rhythms that revealed intent. And later, as I brushed my teeth, the thin bathroom wall carried Celeste's hushed voice into the room. She was whispering into the phone, her tone sharp beneath the sweetness, saying no, not yet, she's not as pliable as I thought, but give it time, the words slicing through the air until the phrase that followed made me grip the counter tighter. Every girl cracks once you control the assets. I turned off the faucet slowly, not in fear, but in a kind of certainty, my pulse steadying instead of racing, because I finally saw the truth of it. Her moves were never about generosity, only about control. It was not just my name missing from the car's title, it was a calculated test, one I had resisted and therefore passed, and with that knowledge burning quietly inside me, I woke the next morning, looked at Dean, and told him with measured calm that I needed some air. Just a walk, maybe a coffee, I told him, and he kissed my temple without lifting his eyes from the glow of his iPad, content to believe the story I offered. But instead of heading toward the park as he assumed, I walked 2 blocks down, slipped into a rental car I had reserved the night before under my maiden name, and drove out to an office building on the edge of town, its tall windows reflecting the morning light and a sign at the entrance quietly reading Hill and Company. Work. I swiped my card at the door, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and settled into a desk that carried the faint mixed scent of lavender and old coffee, familiar and grounding. When I opened my laptop, the truth glowed on the screen in quiet triumph. My company's dashboard, steady and strong, a world Dean and Celeste knew nothing about. Sales were up 11% from the previous quarter. Subscriber growth continued to rise at a consistent pace, and fresh partnership offers waited neatly flagged for my review. I pulled open a blank page in my private journal and let my fingers move across the keys with measured precision, typing slowly, deliberately, the words that would anchor me. Do not react emotionally. Observe, protect, wait. Each instruction felt like a mantra, a shield against the chaos swirling just beyond my control, a reminder that patience was power if wielded with care. After a pause, I added the thought that pulsed through me with certainty. Silence is not submission. Silence is space. The distance needed to listen, the room required to plan. With that written, I closed the laptop, leaned back in the chair, and let my gaze drift toward the window where the sun was already sliding lower into the trees, painting the world in a fading glow that felt like both warning and promise. I understood now exactly the kind of game I had been drawn into, and I had no intention of folding, no matter how carefully they played their hand. That clarity struck me the very morning the first check cleared from my account without my knowledge, a violation that jolted me into full awareness. It was just past 8 o'clock, and I was sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee at the co-working space when the notification flashed across my phone screen, pulling me upright in my chair. At first, I dismissed it as something routine, a grocery delivery charge perhaps, or a utility bill Dean had set to auto-pay without mentioning. But the moment I opened the alert and saw the figure, $18,000, I sat straighter, the number echoing in my mind. The charge was labeled CEH Advisory, a name completely unfamiliar to me, and as my heart picked up its pace, I immediately opened the bank app to confirm the details, the weight of that unexplained deduction pressing down harder with each second. The record showed the transaction had cleared directly from our joint account, and without hesitation I dialed Dean. He answered cheerfully, his tone light and casual with a breezy, "Hey babe," as though nothing in the world were out of place. I cut through his easy charm with a single question. "What's CEH Advisory?" For a moment there was silence, just long enough for me to hear the soft intake of his breath on the other end, and then he replied, "Oh, that," as though the matter were trivial. He explained it was simply a setup fee for his mother's consulting firm, speaking with a casualness that only deepened my unease. When I pressed that he had moved $18,000 without telling me, he laughed as if I were overreacting, brushing it off with a line about just getting things rolling for her, reminding me how she was trying to start again, and though my frustration rose in my chest, I swallowed it down. We had agreed, I told him firmly, that no financial decision from the joint account would ever be made unless both of us signed off. Remember? I mean, come on, he said, brushing my concern aside with that familiar charm. "We're married now, Zoe. We're family. Everything doesn't have to be so formal anymore. Don't you trust me?" That last word caught in my throat like a bone I couldn't swallow, heavy and sharp, and I stared again at the line item on my screen, CEH Advisory, before ending the call abruptly, unwilling to let frustration push me into saying something I might regret. The rest of the morning, I carried the unease like a weight I couldn't put down. While I responded to client emails and reviewed product reports, my mind kept circling back to the deduction, so I opened another browser tab and began searching. The co-working lounge around me was quiet, filled only with the hum of a distant printer and the scattered rhythm of keyboards, but in that stillness, my focus sharpened as I typed the unfamiliar name into a business registry. I tried again, digging deeper this time through Texas public records, and at last the truth appeared before me in black and white. CEH Advisory LLC, formally established just 2 months before the wedding. My eyes narrowed as I scanned the details, reading each line with growing certainty that this was no coincidence but a deliberate maneuver laid long before I had spoken my vows. Dean's name was listed as a co-signer, but it was Celeste, my mother-in-law, who stood as the registered agent, her signature anchoring the papers. The address of record was their family estate, and the stated purpose, repeated on document after document, was not consulting or coaching, as Dean had implied, but something colder and more direct, business asset transition services. That single word, transition, echoed across the pages like a warning bell. My hands remained poised on the keyboard, yet my body felt strangely removed, as though I had stepped into a room I thought I knew, only to discover every piece of furniture had been quietly rearranged without my permission. What exactly was being transitioned, and more importantly, to whom? That evening back in our apartment, Dean behaved as though nothing had occurred, casually handing me a glass of wine while mentioning a new Thai restaurant he wanted us to try the following weekend. His smile easy, his tone light, as if the ground beneath us hadn't shifted. I returned his smile and nodded the way any ordinary wife might, but beneath the surface my mind raced, sharp and unsettled. In those moments, I remembered the quiet afternoons with my grandfather when he would call me into the sunroom to talk, his voice steady as he passed on the truths he knew I would one day need. "Don't let your silence make them think you're stupid," he had told me. "Let it make them careless." That night, I carried those words like armor, and though I lay in bed beside Dean, I hardly slept at all. The following morning, I found myself back at the estate for dinner, an event that had been arranged well in advance, one of Celeste's celebrated Friday family gatherings. The table was set as if from a magazine spread, roast chicken steaming on fine china, linen napkins folded precisely, soft jazz whispering in the background, every detail curated to project perfection and control. It was a performance as much as a meal, and I could feel it pressing against me with every bite. Halfway through, I set down my fork, folded my napkin slowly in my lap, and with deliberate calm spoke into the air. By the way, I came across something interesting while I was doing some routine searches. Dean looked up from his plate, curiosity flickering across his face as he asked what I meant, and I answered evenly with two simple words, CEH advisory. The response was immediate. Celeste's fork froze mid-air, her composure slipping for the briefest flicker of a second. Her eyes didn't widen, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker so brief most would have missed it. Dean tried to fill the silence with a nervous chuckle, brushing it off with a teasing remark about how I was always Googling things, as though my curiosity were nothing but a harmless quirk. I returned his smile with one of my own and answered lightly that, yes, I always do my due diligence. It's simply a habit. Yet the air around the table grew heavy, the silence lingering a fraction too long until Celeste finally cleared her throat and steered the conversation toward garden renovations. I let her, knowing full well that I had already planted the seed I intended. Later that evening, after I had helped clear the dishes and declined her offer of a nightcap with practiced politeness, I left the estate and drove toward the city center instead of heading home. I parked outside a modest glass-fronted building where I had quietly rented a private desk months earlier, a space that served as my hidden refuge. At that late hour, the building was half empty, only a handful of startup founders still bent over their laptops, the blue light of their screens reflected in their glasses as they kept grinding into the night. I slipped into my usual corner, opened my encrypted financial dashboard, and without hesitation began the transfer. $2.4 million slid from one account into another, into a fresh holding entity I had prepared long before, Shiloh Holdings. The plan was deliberate, the execution precise, the protection airtight, because I had made sure the LLC had been filed months earlier through a completely separate legal team. Delaware-based, clean, quiet, and shielded from prying eyes, it stood exactly as I intended. I had chosen the name Shiloh for a reason, a small tribute that carried a personal weight, because it had been the name of my grandfather's childhood dog, the only living creature, he once told me, had never demanded anything from him. As the wire transfer initiated, I opened my journal, flipped to a fresh page, and in bold block letters began to write the words that would anchor my resolve. They think they're playing chess, but they haven't even found the board. With that thought written in my journal, I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, my breaths steady and measured, not touched by fear but sharpened by clarity, because at last I could see the shape of what was happening and the hand guiding it all. Yet what I didn't realize then was that another transfer was already in motion, this time not from the business accounts, but from the house itself, a scheme advancing quietly in the background as morning light stretched across my desk. It was late morning when I sat in my home office finishing a draft proposal, the sunlight spilling across my keyboard and turning the pages on my desk gold. My tea sat forgotten, long gone cold beside me, but I hardly noticed, too focused on the work in front of me to care. Then came the interruption, 2 sharp rings at the doorbell, short and insistent, cutting through the stillness like a warning. I pushed back my chair slowly, my body taut with unease, and walked to the door, pausing only long enough to peer through the peephole. There she was, Celeste, dressed with her usual composure, pearl earrings glinting, that familiar smug expression resting on her face as though it belonged there permanently. And behind her stood the notary I remembered from the wedding, unchanged in his dark suit, clipboard in hand, waiting like a shadow. My stomach clenched at the sight, the air around me tightening, but I forced myself to unlock the door and open it without a word. "Well, good morning, darling," Celeste beamed, stepping forward as though she were the hostess and not the intruder. "We figured we'd catch you before lunch," she said smoothly, explaining that all she needed was a quick signature. The notary inclined his head in polite acknowledgement, holding out a single-page document, while Celeste extended it toward me as though she were offering cookies at a tea party. Her voice honeyed as she assured me it was just a small formality, already moving into my home without so much as an invitation. Celeste explained with polished ease that it was nothing more than a deed transfer, purely administrative, something meant to protect the family home legally, as though such words could soften the weight of what she placed in front of me. I didn't reach for the paper, not yet, my mind looping sharply through every implication, every hidden motive tucked beneath her syrupy tone. Quietly, I reminded her that this house was already protected, purchased outright, with no liens, no mortgage, secured entirely in my name. She brushed aside my words with a flick of her hand, dismissing them as though they were nothing more than an inconvenience. "Exactly," she said with a smile. "That was the point. Since it now counted as part of the marital household, it only made sense for Dean's name to be added, or rather ours, as she phrased it, for tax purposes." With the ease of someone who had rehearsed the pitch before, she assured me that the deductions we could receive would be plentiful, urging me to trust her, reminding me that she had done this before. At last, I lifted the document and scanned the top line. There was my name, the address of my home written clearly, and then, tucked beneath it, the clause that turned my stomach: transfer of title to Dean Hampton and Celeste Hampton as joint owners. My eyes lifted from the page to hers, my voice edged with suspicion as I asked, "And the notary's here for—" She only widened her smile, leaning in with that same false sweetness. "Sweetheart, we're just making it official, quick and easy," she said, promising that I'd feel so much better once everything was settled. The air shifted with the sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and unhurried, until Dean appeared, barefoot, rubbing sleep from his eyes as though he had just woken from a peaceful dream. He glanced at the paper in my hand, muttered a casual, "Hey, babe," and with no awareness of the storm beneath the surface added easily, "It's no big deal," as though the attempt to strip me of ownership could be reduced to nothing more than a formality. Dean tried to explain it away with a careless tone, saying his mother had already gone over everything and insisting it was no big deal, but I kept my voice even as I asked the only question that mattered: "You're signing my house over to yourself and your mother?" He exhaled sharply, telling me it wasn't like that, accusing me of making it sound shady, when in his mind it was nothing more than practical. I folded the document slowly, refusing to let emotion show, and replied calmly, "Isn't it?" Celeste tilted her head in mock sympathy, her voice soft as she said, "Zoe, we're your family," as if the word itself could erase the theft behind her smile. She pressed further, telling me I was acting like a stranger, and I met Dean's eyes as I reminded him of what we had agreed upon before the wedding, that our assets would remain separate, that our foundation would be built on trust rather than intrusion. He only shrugged, dismissing the promise with casual indifference, saying that plans change, that we were a unit now, weren't we, and questioning why I was being so formal. I didn't speak the words rising in my throat, but inside I knew the truth, because I finally saw him, really saw him, and the clarity froze something within me. It felt as though a thread had been cut clean through, severing whatever warmth I had once felt for this new family. The affection that had seemed possible just days earlier shrank to a pinpoint of cold detachment, a space where trust could no longer live. I nodded slowly, folded the deed once more, and told them I would think about it. For the first time, Celeste's polished smile faltered, flickering for half a second before she regained her composure, smoothing her expression as she replied, "Of course, take your time," though the edge in her tone betrayed her urgency. She warned that these things were best handled quickly, before fiscal deadlines rolled in, her words sweet but sharp, a reminder cloaked in concern. When they finally left, the house was silent again, yet I remained standing at the window for a long time, the deed still clutched in my hand. A breeze slipped through the curtains, moving them gently as though the room were light, but the weight pressing down on me was anything but, heavy with the knowledge of what they had tried to take. That afternoon, I drove into downtown without telling Dean where I was going. My destination, a modest law office, tucked discreetly between a dentist's practice and a small boutique. The receptionist glanced up as I stepped inside, and instead of asking my purpose, she simply asked who I needed to see. I replied that I needed someone familiar with Texas property law, and she quickly paired me with a man named Elijah Corbin, mid-50s, with calm, steady eyes and a bolo tie that suggested both confidence and simplicity. I laid the folded deed across his desk without ceremony. "Can you tell me what this would mean if I signed it?" I asked, my voice low but firm. He scanned the document silently, line by line, his expression tightening as he absorbed the details, and finally, he looked up to meet my gaze. "If you sign this," he explained, "you'd be transferring legal ownership of the house, full rights. That means if they chose to sell it, refinance it, or borrow against it, they could do so without ever needing your consent. And what if the house was purchased under my premarital trust?" I pressed, watching his eyes sharpen. He raised an eyebrow at that revelation, his voice measured as he replied that in such a case they would need to prove spousal entitlement or cohabitation intent backed by joint assets. "But you said it was in a trust?" he clarified, and I nodded, explaining that I had funded it through an LLC tied directly to my grandfather's legacy trust. At that, his entire demeanor shifted from detached professionalism to cautious gravity. "Do you have the original trust documents?" he asked. I told him I did, and I added that my grandfather had insisted on a clause stating that no assets under that trust could ever be reassigned or transferred without a formal board review. Elijah nodded slowly, letting the weight of that detail sink into the silence between us, before concluding in a steady voice that signing this deed would not merely risk the house. It could very well trigger a breach. "But it also gives you leverage," Elijah had said, and those words carried me through the evening as I returned home just after sunset. Dean was stretched out in the living room watching football, his posture casual, his demeanor untouched, as though nothing at all had occurred. I offered no comment. Instead, in the stillness of my office, I opened the fireproof safe, placed the unsigned deed carefully inside, labeled the folder, and locked it away again. Then I turned to my laptop, searching for an old email from my grandfather's lawyer, one he had sent me when I turned 25 and assumed partial control of the holdings. His name was Thomas Denham, a man still practicing, still loyal to my grandfather's memory, and it was to him I composed a message. Slowly, deliberately, I typed the subject line, "Family Property Inquiry." I attached a scanned copy of the deed and wrote a short note with no theatrics, no emotion, just the facts laid bare. When it was ready, I pressed send. My hands did not tremble. I did not feel the need to burn the paper or destroy evidence. I had simply lit the fuse beneath the elaborate fantasy they had been trying to construct. Brick by stolen brick, their foundation had been crumbling, and I had just delivered the final crack. That had been Thursday. By Saturday morning, Dean seemed to have reset himself entirely, sliding back into the role of cheerful husband as though the last confrontation had never taken place. He leaned against the kitchen doorway wearing his favorite gray Henley, watching me pour coffee with a smile far too bright for the tension we both remembered, and he suggested lightly that we grab brunch together. Just us. No mothers. No lawyers. I lifted my eyes over the rim of my mug, repeating the word back as though testing it. "Brunch?" He nodded quickly, slipping his phone into his pocket and returning my look with practiced ease. "Yeah," he said, "it might be nice to reconnect, to reset." The word echoed in my mind like a bell, reverberating with layers he probably thought I would ignore, but I caught its sharp edge and held onto it in silence. Reset. That was the word he used, as if I were nothing more than a device he could reboot, wipe clean, and program to run smoothly again. Still, I agreed to brunch, Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because I needed to see what version of him would appear next. He chose a cafe downtown, casual yet overpriced, the kind of place that served eggs on cutting boards and labeled burnt slices of bread as artisan toast. We sat near the window where sunlight streamed through, and Dean folded his hands across the table with the air of someone about to open a team meeting. "You've been working like crazy," he began, his voice coated in ease as he poured syrup across pancakes he hardly touched. "I'm proud of you, babe. Seriously." The words came with a smile that looked too polished, too perfectly balanced, the kind of smile that could only come from rehearsal in front of a mirror. I thanked him softly, stirring my iced coffee in slow circles, and then reminded him that he had said he wanted to talk. "Yeah," he admitted after a pause, his confidence thinning for just a second. "You know, this whole house situation with Mom, the trust, it wasn't meant to feel like we were ganging up on you." I tilted my head, meeting his eyes with steady calm, and asked evenly, "You weren't?" His chuckle was nervous, the sound of someone trying to patch a crack in the wall with nothing but charm. "Okay, maybe it wasn't the best way to bring it up," he conceded, but then his tone shifted, searching for new ground. "I was thinking, now that we're married, it might make sense to consider, well, maybe starting a family." I blinked at the leap in logic, the sudden shift of terrain, my surprise plain in the single word that left me. "That's a leap." He reached across the table then, his hand sliding toward mine with the eagerness of someone hoping a touch could soften the blow his words had already delivered. "I mean it," he insisted, leaning in with conviction. "We're a team, right? We should plan for the future, protect our legacy." The word made my stomach tighten just as his phone buzzed against the table, the screen lighting up for an instant. I caught it in that brief flicker, Merrill J., before he flipped it over with a smooth, practiced motion and offered me a sheepish grin. "Work," he said quickly, brushing it aside. "She's just a coordinator from our old agency, always blowing up my phone." "Uh-huh," I replied, letting the syllables hang as he pulled his hand back. "Anyway," he continued, shifting gears, "I was thinking maybe we should put the company into a family trust. You know, streamline things, tax benefits, future kids, that sort of plan." I didn't answer right away, letting silence settle as I studied him carefully, really looked at him without flinching until I finally asked the question that cut to the heart of it. "Which family?" Dean blinked, startled. "What?" "You said family trust," I repeated evenly. "So which family, yours and Celeste's, or mine?" His laugh came out awkward, too thin, like he hadn't expected me to press. "Ours, of course," he said quickly. "I just meant it as a safety measure." "A safety measure for whom?" I asked, my tone calm but edged with steel, because my name is on that company. "Alone." His jaw tightened, the mask slipping just enough for me to see what lay beneath. "I didn't mean anything by it, Zoe," he muttered, and I offered the word for him. "Cautious." He sighed in defeat, trying to soften it again. "Look, it's not about control," he said. "It's about building something. Together. Faster." The repetition caught me, and I heard it clearly this time, the urgency laced beneath the gloss, the greed pulsing beneath his polished words. "What would you do," I asked slowly, "if the company didn't exist?" Dean blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "If the company disappeared tomorrow, would you still be here?" "Of course I would," he said quickly, but then, almost without pause, he added that with it we could really go places. And there it was, that future he kept describing as if he had already calculated every dollar and plotted every step, a life mapped out on paper where I was the resource and he was the dreamer. I nodded, feigning thoughtfulness, but inside something deep within me settled into clarity. That night, once we returned home and he drifted into half-sleep watching basketball from the bed, I slipped quietly into my office, switched on the lamp, the drawer that held my prenuptial agreement, untouched since the wedding. The paper gave a faint crackle as I unfolded it, the sound sharp in the stillness. My grandfather had insisted on layers of protection I had barely understood at the time, layers I had thought were excessive, even paranoid. But I trusted him then, and now I understood why. Line by line, I read carefully, letting each phrase anchor me until my eyes stopped on the clause that changed everything. In the event that a marital partner attempts to modify ownership or control of protected trust assets through direct or indirect legal instruments, including but not limited to deeds, transfers, or trusts, an automatic freeze will be triggered pending trustee board review. The language was precise, airtight, and as I absorbed it, I exhaled through my nose, quiet and sharp, as though releasing years of tension in a single breath. He had seen this coming, not Dean specifically, but the type of man who would smile with polished charm while plotting to pry open what was never his. My grandfather had anticipated this moment, and through the ink on that page, he had given me a shield strong enough to withstand it. I sat back in my chair, the prenup open before me, and whispered softly into the silence, "Thank you." The next morning, I let silence do the work for me. I didn't bring up the prenup, didn't mention what I had discovered, and I allowed the air to stay light so that Dean could believe we had moved past everything. But later that night, just after midnight, I stirred awake at the sound of his whispering in the dark. I stayed still, my body heavy with feigned sleep, and simply listened. His voice was low, nearly swallowed by the quiet, but the cadence gave him away. "No, she hasn't signed anything yet," he murmured, "but I'll get it. Just a matter of time." My hand slipped carefully under the pillow, finding my phone by touch, and with a single motion I pressed record. One line, one fragment of his scheming, was all I needed. He thought I was asleep, unaware, but I was more awake than he could imagine, just not in the way he expected. I didn't flinch when the bedroom door clicked softly behind him, nor did I move when his footsteps carried him down the hall, fading into the shadows of the house. Instead, I stayed where I was, lying still, my gaze fixed on the window, where the faintest threads of dawn were beginning to press against the curtains, pale and patient, like a truth too tired to keep itself hidden. By the time Dean returned to the room, I had already shaped my expression into something soft and familiar, the look of a woman half asleep, trusting, unaware. When he leaned down to kiss my cheek, I stirred just enough to mumble a drowsy response, sweet and believable, and he smiled at the illusion. I smiled back, matching his performance with one of my own, and the following morning unfolded like theater. I brewed coffee with steady hands, toasted slices of bread, and slid scrambled eggs onto his plate, careful not to let them overcook, each gesture deliberate, each movement designed to keep him comfortable, never suspecting that the silence between us had shifted into something far sharper than he could see. Just how he liked it. Dean sat at the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone with the ease of a man convinced he was master of the house, pausing only to murmur between bites that I was spoiling him. I laughed softly, brushing it off as a special occasion, teasing that he had made it through brunch without once bringing up stocks. He grinned, leaned in to kiss my forehead, and then shrugged on his jacket with that casual authority he wore like a second skin. "Be good today," he told me, and I answered as always. I stood at the window as the front door closed behind him, watching as he started the car, listening until the sound of the engine dwindled down the street. Still I remained there, frozen, staring at the space he had left behind until even my own breath startled me back into movement, reminding me I had not shifted in minutes. Finally, I turned away, my resolve sharp, and walked toward my office. There, I opened the encrypted folder I hadn't touched in years, the one marked simply with my grandfather's initials, and inside lay the digital copy of the prenup. I downloaded the file, scrolling slowly, line by line, highlighting every clause that concerned asset control, power of attorney, and marital leverage. The phrasing was exact, designed with precision, each word chosen like a blade. The kind of clarity only someone who had spent decades building empires while fending off vultures could craft. My eyes narrowed as I reached one section in particular, the kind of provision that shifted the ground beneath everything else. I flagged it carefully, then slid open the desk drawer and pulled out a small black case, its weight solid in my hand, a reminder that I was not unarmed in this game. Inside the black case were two compact hidden cameras. I placed one carefully in the corner of my study, its lens concealed by a ceramic vase, and tucked the other into the guest room lamp, angled just right to catch any whispered strategy that might unfold within those walls. Then came the backups, emails, voicemails, transaction logs, all quietly uploaded to a private cloud beyond anyone's reach. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. And I had learned the difference the hard way. By noon, I slipped on a navy blazer and stepped out of the house without a word to Dean. He would assume I had gone painting, or maybe wandered off shopping for gallery supplies. Let him assume. That was safer. The building I arrived at hadn't changed in years. The same polished brass nameplate by the door, the same slow elevator humming upward with its steady grind, carrying me back into a world my grandfather had once walked with absolute certainty. The law office was on the 7th floor, tucked discreetly behind frosted glass and framed oil paintings of West Texas landscapes. When I entered, Mr. Ellison rose from behind his desk, his handshake firm and warm, though his eyes studied me closely, reading me the way one reads a report for patterns, conclusions, truths between the lines. "Zoe," he said gently, guiding me toward a chair. "Your grandfather asked me to hold a folder for you. I never thought we'd actually need it." I lowered myself into the seat, my voice calm but edged as I answered. "Neither did I, but something has changed." He waited, silent and patient, as I reached into my coat pocket and drew out my phone. With deliberate ease, I tapped the screen and pressed play, the room filling with the sound of Dean's whisper, low, damning, and undeniable. Dean's voice spilled softly from my phone, hushed and urgent, the words sharp in their simplicity. "She hasn't signed anything yet, but I'll get it." Ellison didn't probe or press for explanation. He only exhaled, long and steady, before moving to the cabinet behind him. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a sealed envelope and slid it across the desk with deliberate care. "Your grandfather called it a just-in-case packet," he explained, his tone carrying both weight and warning. "He told me," Ellison continued, "that if charm ever turned into chess, this would be the moment to give it to you." My fingers trembled only slightly as I broke the seal and pulled out a slim file labeled in bold, Post-Marital Amendment, Trigger Protocol. Inside was a clause I had never seen before, not in the prenup, not in the trust documents, nowhere in the years of records I had studied. It had been hidden, dormant, waiting, but binding. The language was stark. If a spouse was found manipulating or attempting to gain access to trust assets under the false pretense of love or partnership, the entire prenup would be voided. In its place, an automatic corporate freeze would lock everything, shares, property rights, influence, into a temporary hold, accessible only by the trust's original heir. Me. It was more than protection. It was foresight sharpened into armor. "He really thought of everything," I murmured, my throat tightening with a knot of gratitude and grief. Ellison nodded slowly, his expression softened with memory. "He always worried someone would try to love you for your name, not for who you are. Not because you were weak, but because you were kind. And kindness," he said quietly, "is the easiest target of all." I didn't cry, and I didn't even blink. I looked Ellison directly in the eye and said with steady calm, "Let's start the process." For hours we worked side by side drafting the amendment packet, line by line, detail by detail. Every asset I owned under the company's name, every dollar, deed, and share, would be temporarily sealed against marital claims. Even voting rights were locked down. The only key remained with me. Ellison's team moved quickly but cautiously, and one of the junior lawyers warned in a low voice that I needed to act before Dean attempted to file anything jointly. I nodded with certainty. "I will." By the time I drove back home, the afternoon sun had already lowered, painting the house in a warm, honey-colored glow. From the front step, The air carried the smell of something cooking, familiar and homely. When I stepped inside, Dean was in the kitchen, humming lightly as if the world were simple. A pot of chili bubbled on the stove, and he looked up with an easy grin when he saw me. "Hey, stranger," he said brightly. "I thought I'd make dinner tonight." He framed it as his way of thanking me for brunch, and I slipped off my shoes, walked to the kettle, and poured myself a cup of herbal tea in silence. He turned back to stir the pot, speaking over his shoulder as though testing my loyalty. "We're a team, right?" I lifted the cup slowly, met his gaze across the kitchen, and answered with measured calm, "I guess we'll see soon." He chuckled, missing the weight hidden in the words, his laugh too casual for the storm gathering beneath us. An hour later, he excused himself, saying he had a few errands to run, pressing a quick kiss to my cheek before promising he wouldn't be long. The moment the front door clicked shut behind him, I set my tea aside and walked swiftly to my office. On my laptop, the monitoring dashboard lit up with activity, one alert pulsing red across the screen. Courthouse Wi-Fi access. The moment his phone connected to the courthouse Wi-Fi, the alert told me all I needed to know. I didn't wait. I opened the secure folder, attached the amendment documents Ellison and I had prepared, and pressed send. The confirmation screen blinked once, sealing everything into place. By the time Dean lifted his pen to file his petition, mine had already rewritten the future. I wasn't at the courthouse, but I didn't need to be. Dean arrived there like a man convinced he still held the upper hand. He was clean-shaven, dressed in a crisp shirt, a folder tucked neatly under his arm, as though the formality of appearance alone gave him authority. I could picture him clearly, hear the light, smug tone he reserved for waiters, clerks, anyone he believed stood beneath him, the voice that dripped with condescension disguised as charm. "This should be simple," he likely said, sliding the folder across the counter as though he were granting the system a favor by letting it process his request. But this time, the system spoke back, and the words cut deeper than any signature. "There's already a legal freeze in place, sir." The phrase landed flat, unshaken, a wall he hadn't expected to hit. According to my lawyer, the clock barely glanced up from her screen when she delivered it, but Dean blinked in shock, leaning forward as if his hearing had failed. He asked again, slower this time, his tone forced, firmer. Without hesitation, the clerk turned her monitor toward him, the glow of the display sealing the truth in black and white. "Filed this morning, 9:17 a.m., by Zoe Thornwright." They said his face drained of color, his composure collapsing in an instant. He stepped back as though the floor itself had tilted beneath him, then fumbled for his phone and dialed his mother. Straight to voicemail. He tried again, more desperate this time, but the line still refused him. Finally, he called me, twice. I let it ring each time, untouched, the silence on my end deliberate. Instead, I sat calmly in a downtown boardroom, surrounded by people who already knew the full truth, people I had trusted long before Dean ever appeared in my life. The walls were glass, transparent to the city outside, but inside the air was dense with strategy, with decisions being carved into permanence. At the head of the long table, I reviewed the amendment packet once more, the pages steady beneath my hands. Legal advisors flanked me on either side, their pens ready, their eyes sharp. Across from me sat my mentor, arms folded, his gaze steady and unwavering, a silent reminder of strength. At the far end of the table, the estate lawyer, Mr. Pelham, adjusted his glasses and nodded once, his voice calm but carrying weight as he tapped the document. "This amendment," he said, "ensures no spouse can exert influence over this company unless they were a financial contributor or a founding shareholder." The board voted in sequence one by one, voices clear and firm. When it came to me, I lifted the pen without hesitation and signed, my hand steady, my will unshaken. The ink flowed smoothly, and though my wedding ring caught the light for a brief moment, I refused to look at it, not once. "Motion carried," Mr. Pelham declared, his tone final. I exhaled slowly, the weight of months lifting in that single breath. It was the kind of breath you realize you've been holding for years without ever knowing it, and when it left me, the room seemed clearer, sharper. Dean wasn't just cut off from my estate that day. He was severed from the very influence he believed he had married into. The leverage he thought was his had dissolved, and the foundation of his plans crumbled beneath him. But there was still more. Mr. Pelham slid a second folder across the polished table, its edges worn with age, the pages inside slightly yellowed yet meticulously preserved. "My grandfather left this to be opened only under certain conditions," I said quietly. "And you met them," Pelham replied, glancing around at the faces gathered. Every single one. Inside the folder lay documents, some stamped officially, others initialed in my grandfather's familiar hand, careful strokes that felt like echoes of his voice. They revealed quiet moves he had made years before, ones even I hadn't fully understood. 26% of voting rights had been transferred to me, not just in the main company Dean knew about, but in 2 smaller subsidiaries hidden beneath layers of shell entities. Combined, they gave me control of 81%. That changed everything. I wasn't only the CEO anymore, I was the majority. No vote could override me, no shareholder could outpace me, no scheme could topple what I now held in my hands. "You're the final decision maker," the lawyer said, his tone firm, almost reverent. I nodded once, expression calm, refusing to smile. And across town, Dean wasn't celebrating his marriage or his future. He was walking into our home like a storm without rain. Fast, loud, and empty. That was how he came home. But I had already been gone for hours, leaving nothing behind for him but silence and a single envelope resting on the counter. Inside, he found a photograph from our wedding day. At first glance, it was nothing unusual, just the kind of posed image couples tuck into albums, but if he looked closely, if he zoomed into the crook of his mother's elbow, he would see the detail he had missed all along. An uncapped pen, visible in her purse during our vows. Beneath the photo lay a note in my handwriting, sharp and deliberate. "You never asked me what I inherited. You just assumed I wouldn't know how to protect it." The words landed harder than any confrontation, and when he finished reading, panic set in. He tore through the house, racing upstairs, down hallways, slamming open doors. Closets were empty, desk drawers were bare. In the bedroom, the safe gaped open, already stripped clean, its shelves vacant. On the property deed, his name had already been erased. Desperate, Dean called his mother again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. He tried once more, still nothing. Then came the sound of 3 sharp knocks at the front door, pulling him toward the final truth he hadn't prepared for. He opened it, his expression caught between disbelief and denial, only to find an officer standing there with a thick manila folder. "Mr. Dean Westbrook?" the man asked before extending the envelope. "You've been served." And just like that, everything Dean had assumed was his collapsed around him. He thought marriage was a transaction, but I reminded him that contracts protect more than money. They protect dignity. The judge slid his glasses higher on his nose and addressed Dean's attorneys with calm finality. "None of what you've presented carries weight," he declared. "Her documents were executed, notarized, and filed before the marriage ever took place. The trust is recognized as separate property, and the prenuptial modifications are fully enforceable." At the defense table, Dean shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching hard as if trying to grind disbelief into dust. One of his lawyers leaned close, whispering something urgent, but the words only deepened the rigidity in his face. The judge's tone softened almost to casual conversation as he added, "She outmaneuvered you, didn't she?" I kept still. I didn't answer, didn't spare Dean a glance. Instead, I focused on the quiet moment where truth arrived and left no space for denial. Dean hadn't merely miscalculated my resolve, he had misunderstood everything about what bound us together. This fight had never been about guarding dollars in an account. It was about safeguarding identity, about protecting legacy, about wielding silence as both shield and weapon. Those were the things he failed to see, and they were stronger than anything he had brought against me. At last, Dean turned his head, his eyes narrowing on me with a look sharp enough to cut, searching for a version of me he no longer recognized. His attorney's voice broke slightly as he asked whether Dean had realized I had set all of this in motion before the vows were spoken. Dean didn't respond. Hours later, as the courtroom emptied and the buzzing of arguments quieted into the monotony of paperwork, my thoughts wandered far from the oak benches and back into memory. Years earlier, before the ceremony, the morning was still pale and cool. My wedding dress hadn't yet been steamed, and I found myself standing alone in my grandfather's garden, the first sunlight brushing across the petals of his prized white camellias. In my hand, I held a velvet box, unassuming in its size and weight. Inside rested 2 rings, one slim, engraved with our initials, fragile in its hope. The other appeared plain, a solid gold band heavier than it seemed, though beneath its surface a microchip was hidden, invisible to any eye but deliberately placed. I could still hear my grandfather's voice from that morning over tea, calm and steady, as he reminded me that weddings symbolize love, yes, but they are also about structure. Never agree to a contract you didn't write, he had warned. Never let your name be tied to terms that don't honor your values. I hadn't imagined then that I would wield those words like armor, but I had obeyed them. 2 weeks before walking down the aisle, I executed a temporary transfer of every personal share I owned to a silent partner. On paper, I appeared to bring nothing into the marriage at all. What Dean saw was the image he preferred, a bride whose only offering was love, whose worth seemed measured in sentiment rather than ownership. He never looked deeper. He was too distracted with details he thought mattered more, making sure his mother's tennis circle had seats and hiring an overpriced quartet to play as if spectacle could replace substance. While he arranged appearances, I arranged protection. And now, as the divorce petition prepared to hit the court, those very shares had already flowed quietly back to me under an irrevocable clause. The firm handling the process had confirmed the transfer and filed it with the court before Dean's team could intervene. His lawyer, young, eager, maybe even brilliant in a different arena, tried one last desperate argument, declaring it smelled like fraud. The judge didn't even hesitate before replying. Number it smells like preparation. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courthouse, sharp and final, signaling the end of proceedings for the day. Case adjourned. By that afternoon, as clerks circulated paperwork and Dean's lawyers scrambled to salvage their footing, he reverted to the one reaction he always had when control slipped through his hands. He stormed in. I was in my office, seated with my operations lead, quietly reviewing quarterly reports when the door flew open. He didn't bother with a knock. The door hit the wall with a bang. His voice cracked through the air, sharp and accusatory. "Was any of this real to you?" I lifted my eyes from the page with deliberate calm. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his frustration spilling over, the trusts, the shares, the prenups, all of it. Was I just another piece in some elaborate scheme? I rose from my chair, not because I felt threatened, but because the moment itself demanded finality. "Dean," I said evenly, "I married you, not your bank account, not your holdings, you. But you and your mother came into that marriage as though it were a corporate takeover. She didn't walk into the church to celebrate us. She walked in to size me up, as though I were a risk on a balance sheet." His jaw tightened once more, the accusation burning behind his teeth. "You tricked me." "No," I answered, steady as stone. "You never believed I was capable of being anything more than a placeholder. I didn't deceive you, Dean. I safeguarded what was mine. You always acted as though it were yours to direct, as though my life and legacy had been placed in your hands by default." I slipped the ring from my finger without a word and set it on the table, the band making a small metallic sound against the wood. Sharp, final, cold. He stared at it for a moment, then turned away, leaving the room without reaching for it. Later that night, I asked my assistant to confirm the right address. Celeste hadn't answered a single one of Dean's calls, but I knew exactly where she would be, perched in that white leather chair she loved to brag about, her favorite symbol of status. I packed the ring carefully, no sentimentality, no flourish. Just a single card inside the box, plain cardstock with one line written across it. Next time, bring a capped pen, not a script you wrote in advance. It was mailed overnight, deliberate and unadorned. The next morning, I returned to my apartment, the quiet space filled with the soft orange glow of sunrise spilling across the skyline and stretching long shadows through the living room. My assistant was already there, flipping through reports, and handed me a folder with a steady hand. "Ma'am," she said, "you'll want to see this." Inside were the company's post-restructuring numbers. Profits had climbed, and not by a little, but significantly. I didn't smile, didn't comment. I sat by the window, opened the folder, closed it again, and let silence wrap around me like a mantle. It felt earned. When I finally checked my phone, one unread message waited from my grandfather's attorney. The land deal he had spent years arranging, the one he had never stopped working toward, had at last gone through. The title was officially in my name now. He'd be proud, the message read, and I believed it. The ring might have been surrendered, but the legacy I had rebuilt with my own hands could never be stolen. 3 weeks had passed since that day. The paperwork had been completed, signed, stamped, and filed, every line carrying my name alone. Zoe Hart. There it was, unaccompanied, on every document that mattered. Dean's final appeal had been dismissed, the denial swift and absolute. His lawyer hardly lifted his eyes when the ruling was delivered, as though the weight of failure had already pressed him flat. No shares, no stake, no lingering rights to the company, the estate, or even the narrative he once thought belonged to him. What he was left with was emptiness, a name he could no longer claim, a life he had never deserved. My attorney clasped my hand gently and said the words I had been waiting for, "You're free." I nodded. That was all. I didn't raise a glass, I didn't celebrate, and I didn't even exhale with relief. Freedom didn't feel like fireworks, it felt like gravity. I left the law office quietly, bypassing the elevators and heading straight for the parking garage where my car waited in its space. Outside, the air held the sharp edge of early spring, suspended between the promise of renewal and the final chill of winter's bite. The season itself felt like a mirror, an ending disguised as a beginning, or perhaps the other way around. It felt fitting, almost inevitable. Instead of driving straight home, I let the car wander through the long way back, down streets I had known for years, past neighborhoods that had shifted and grown while I wasn't paying attention. Eventually, I pulled up to the corner lot where the old gas station still stood, or rather, what was left of it. The pumps had been hauled away weeks earlier, and temporary fencing now wrapped around the building like a makeshift bandage. Yet inside, something new was already stirring to life. The instant I stepped across the threshold, the air carried the scent of sawdust mingled with the faint trace of oil embedded deep into the walls. It wasn't unpleasant. It was memory itself, alive and familiar. I drifted toward the back, just past where the service counter had once been, letting my eyes scan the brickwork. Near the baseboard, one brick looked subtly different, the mortar around it chipped as if it had been pried loose at some point in the past. Instinct guided me as I knelt, pressed my palm against it, and felt it give slightly beneath my touch. I worked it free, and behind it was a small envelope, its paper yellowed with time. My hands trembled faintly as I slid it out. Inside lay a photograph. The sight of it drew a smile before I could stop myself. I must have been 4 years old, perched cross-legged on my grandfather's lap, his grease-stained hands holding me steady while I laughed at something just out of the frame. Behind us, the same gas station stood tall, unchanged, captured in its prime, and tucked behind the photo was a folded note. The handwriting was his, tight, upright, disciplined, no nonsense at all. "This isn't an inheritance, Zoe. It's a mirror. Build something that reflects who you are, not what they expect you to be." His words stared back at me from the page, steady and uncompromising. I stood in the quiet for a long time, breathing them in, letting them settle into me. That weekend, I returned to the old station, not with blueprints or proposals, but with folding chairs and a handful of volunteers. We opened the doors, not for profit, but for people. The back room was transformed into a small, free library with my assistant's help, shelves lined with donated books. A friend from the food pantry suggested we create a simple voucher system so single mothers could get gas for job interviews or picking up their children. We didn't market it. We didn't even put up a sign. And yet, word spread. People arrived because they heard. One afternoon, while I was sliding children's books onto a shelf, a woman in her 60s walked in carrying a bag of warm muffins. "I heard what you're doing here," she said softly. "You could have sold this place and vanished. Why stay?" I looked at her, let the silence stretch a beat before answering. "Because I wanted to remind myself where the real value is." She nodded with quiet understanding. "You're making a difference," she said, "and not the kind you measure in deposits." We shared a low laugh before she set the bag on the counter and slipped away. A few days later, I crossed paths with Dean. It wasn't arranged, it wasn't expected, but it was inevitable. It hadn't been planned, not even imagined. I'd stopped into a small downtown cafe for a late lunch, and there he was at a nearby table, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on a crumpled printout. His suit sagged now, too loose across the shoulders, rumpled at the knees, a shadow of the man who once entered every room with certainty. When he finally looked up, our eyes met. He rose slowly, hesitation hanging in the space between us before he stepped closer. "I guess congratulations are in order," he said, his tone flat, stripped of its old bravado. I didn't answer. After a pause, he asked, "Was it worth it?" I drew in a long, steady breath. "Not the money," I told him silently with my eyes, "the clarity." He shifted, unsettled, as if he wanted to fight, to argue, to reclaim something already gone. But no words came. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving the chapter to close on its own. A few nights later, I returned to the cemetery at sunset, waiting until the sky bled into soft streaks of gold and lavender. The grass was damp beneath my shoes as I knelt beside my grandfather's stone, unchanged, unpretentious, solid as ever. In my hands, I carried 3 offerings, each one chosen with care. The first was a copy of the new company charter, streamlined, humane, a structure rebuilt with integrity. The second was the old photograph from the envelope, his grease-stained hand steadying me on his lap, reminding me where I had come from. And the last was my wedding ring. I placed it gently atop the papers, watching the band catch the last of the light. "I almost forgot who I was," I whispered into the evening air, and the silence that followed felt like his answer. It hadn't been planned, not even imagined. I'd stopped into a small downtown cafe for a late lunch, and there he was at a nearby table, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on a crumpled printout. His suit sagged now, too loose across the shoulders, rumpled at the knees, a shadow of the man who once entered every room with certainty. When he finally looked up, our eyes met. He rose slowly, hesitation hanging in the space between us, before he stepped closer. "I guess congratulations are in order," he said, his tone flat, stripped of its old bravado. I didn't answer. After a pause, he asked, "Was it worth it?" I drew in a long, steady breath. "Not the money," I told him silently with my eyes. "The clarity." He shifted, unsettled, as if he wanted to fight, to argue, to reclaim something already gone. But no words came. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving the chapter to close on its own. A few nights later, I returned to the cemetery at sunset, waiting until the sky bled into soft streaks of gold and lavender. The grass was damp beneath my shoes as I knelt beside my grandfather's stone, unchanged, unpretentious, solid as ever. In my hands I carried 3 offerings, each one chosen with care. The first was a copy of the new company charter, streamlined, humane, a structure rebuilt with integrity. The second was the old photograph from the envelope, his grease-stained hands steadying me on his lap, reminding me where I had come from. And the last was my wedding ring. I placed it gently atop the papers, watching the band catch the last of the light. I almost forgot who I was, I whispered into the evening air, and the silence that followed felt like his answer. And in that silence, I understood the truth. What I had preserved wasn't just wealth or a name, but the strength to define myself on my own terms. Legacy wasn't about what I inherited, it was about what I chose to build and who I refused to become. If you're here with me in this story, don't forget to hit that like. It really helps me keep creating. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and tell me in the comments what you felt while listening. Your words and your support mean more than you know.